morning. Good morning.
Oh, there we go. I was like, when I said the good morning, I didn't hear it in the speaker, so I was wondering if I needed to grab a handheld. My weekly plug, if you haven't grabbed a bookmark yet and you want to read along beforehand, I encourage you to do so. Like this week, there's like 4 or 5 chapters I have in there for you all to read, just to give you some background and kind of what's going on. But we're really only going to focus on one chapter in the sermon here. And so there is benefit to reading through that before you come in, just so you can kind of have an idea of what's happening. And so I do encourage you to grab one of those bookmarks, and sometime during the week, take a moment and read through those passages. American author Anne Lamott, I hope I was saying that right, but Anne Lamott once said, or I'm quoting her, and she says, "You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do." Let me repeat that. You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. As humans, we seem to naturally hate others, don't we? We seem to naturally form enemies. Now, they may not be enemies on the battlefield like you sometimes think of enemies, but you might have an enemy at work or an enemy in your social life, or someone who's kind of like always kind of grinding on you, or someone who maybe has caused you some sort of harm that you kind of see as antagonistic to you. You see, we want God then to have those same feelings because we want to feel justified in those feelings. We want to think that they're against God because they're against us. But whenever we do that, we're kind of putting God into our box, which means we're creating a God. We don't truly serve the God. We're making one that we're comfortable with. We want him to hate our enemies, hate those that have wronged us, hate those that have harmed us and hurt us in some way. You see, Jesus had something to say about this. If you have your Bibles with you, we'll be spending most of our time in 1 Samuel 24, but I do want to start today in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, we have the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus has this to say, starting with verse 43, then 44 and 45. It says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven." Now that's not quite what we often do, is it? We like to follow that very first thing when Jesus says, "You have heard it said, love your neighbors and hate your enemies." We're like, okay, yes, we can do that. And then he flips it. He said, "But I say," and notice he doesn't just say, love those that are nice to you. He says, love those and bless those that persecute you. Those that are doing you harm. Those that are wronging you in some way. Love even them. Now, David, in our story today, he knew a little something about having enemies. He knew a little something about having enemies. And David had lots of enemies through his time on this earth. You know, he was a king, so naturally he had other nations that were his enemies. He had people that didn't like him because he was king and things like that. But there was one specific one, especially in his early part of his life, right after he was anointed, that was his enemy. And that was Saul, the first king of Israel. You see, Saul wasn't so keen on the idea that someone was already chosen to replace him. And so Saul didn't really like David all that much. And Saul was not the type of person you want to get on the bad side of, because one, he was the most powerful man in the nation and could have an army at his command. But two, Saul was a bit unstable. One moment he loves you, the next moment he's throwing a spear at your head. I mean, that's Saul. And so you wanted to stay on Saul's good side. And David, to no fault of his own, often found himself not on Saul's good side, because he was the new anointed one, and Saul was the old anointed one. that caused some tension. And so we see that leading up to our story in 1 Samuel 24, we see that Saul wants to kill David. Not just do him harm, he wants him dead. He wants him out of the picture. And so David then goes on the run. And he's running from Saul and hiding from Saul. Because even though he has his own men and he's a great kind of warrior leader who kind of goes with his army into battle, and the Bible even says that Saul conquered his thousands, David conquered his 10,000s. Well, he said that because David was a great military tactician and all this stuff. He really knew what he did, but he's running from Saul because Saul is the king. But there's a moment at the end of chapter 23, at the beginning of chapter 24, where all of a sudden Saul hears word of where David is. And so he goes on the hunt for him. Now we know from probably lots of things that you've heard about David, he's one of the more famous people of the Bible, that he is called a man after God's own heart. So if we know what Jesus said with your enemies, let's look how David responds to his enemy. So if you have Bibles with you, 1 Samuel chapter 24, and we are going to start with verse 3 and go through verse 7 to begin with. Here it says, and he came, the he is Saul, and he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave, and the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord has said to you, behold, I will give you your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. That's what David's men are saying. They're like, this is your chance. Get rid of your enemy. Kill him. He doesn't even know you're here. But then we see how David responds. It says, then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and afterward David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words, and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. David had every chance to do harm back to Saul, but he didn't. And this teaches us a lesson. And the lesson is this: resist doing harm to your enemies. Resist doing harm to your enemies. Now, David had the opportunity to do physical harm to Saul here. He could have easily taken Saul's life. But if we see in the story, he cut off a corner of his robe, and that was even too much for his conscience. After doing that, he feels guilty for doing just that, because he sees Saul as God's anointed one, because he was the anointed king, and as such, he shouldn't lay a hand on him in David's mind. And so he shows, instead of showing him harm and kind of repaying the hurt that he has received, he actually has a different mindset, that he will not harm his enemy. This was great humility on David's part. You know, humility, we talked about it, is not thinking of less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. He could have easily thought of himself in this moment and thought, what is better for me? Well, what was better for him was to eliminate his enemy. But that's not what he did. It's not what he did at all. It probably would have saved him a lot of hurt and harm and heartache later if he would have. But it wasn't what was actually best. And so he didn't harm his enemy. David chose to see Saul's value in God's eyes rather than how Saul had treated him. And we see that David kind of knew this lesson very personally, because we see that in the very first sermon that we did on David's life, we see that God saw the value in who David was, not by his outward appearance. He looked into what David's true value was, and here's David all of a sudden trying to see someone how God sees them, not how everyone else is seeing it. His men are telling him, get rid of him. That's how they see Saul. But he's unwilling to make that leap. He sees Saul as God's anointed one, the one God chose to lead over Israel at this time. And it should not be his hand that takes his life. And so he doesn't. It reminded me as we were going through this and I was doing my study, someone had kind of made a connection to Romans chapter 12 and 1 Samuel 24, which I thought was very good. And so I kind of want to go back and forth here. And so the first verse we're going to read is in Romans chapter 12, verse 17. Romans chapter 12, verse 17, it says, "Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all." Isn't David a perfect picture of that? Don't repay evil for evil. You know, if he would have taken Saul's life, all he would have been doing was repaying evil for evil. And we might think that, oh, well, the Bible even says at times that that's okay, eye for an eye. Come on, get on board with it. But as we remember, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that we just kind of read that it wasn't really an eye for an eye. If someone strikes your cheek, what should you do? Not strike them back. Turn the other cheek. Be willing to get hit again. Here's David, willing to turn the other cheek to get hit again. He's got to know with Saul's wishy-washiness and his extreme emotions where he's going back and forth, that by doing this, he's just opening himself up for the potential of more harm and more hurt. But he continues, and he does what is right. And so this kind of arises a few questions as we're kind of going forward before we get to the next kind of point in the next part of the story. And it says, how do we view those who hurt us? Do we just view the hurt, or do we see how God sees them? Do we see who they were or who they could be? Or are we just looking at the hurt? David, fortunately in this story, he could see past the hurt and see how God saw Saul. We continue on in our story, chapter 24, verses 8 through 13. It says, afterward, David also arose. So Saul has arose and he leaves the cave. And so David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul. And at this point, you're thinking, David, you went from doing the right thing to just being stupid because this guy wants to kill you, and now you're leaving the cave and actually getting his attention. This seems idiotic. But he has a plan here. He says, "My lord, the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know that and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you." He kind of says that, don't repay evil for evil. Out of the wicked comes wickedness. Kind of a similar concept there. But David, we see in the story that he confronts Saul about it. And this kind of brings us to the next thing that we can take from this story, and that's that we need to reconcile with your enemies. Reconcile with your enemies. It's not enough just to resist doing harm to your enemies, but you also need to reconcile with them. And David, he didn't wait for Saul to seek him or Saul to express some sort of regret for what he was doing. He actually sought out the reconciliation. He pursued it. He didn't wait. David wanted to do what was right, whether Saul did what was right or not. This was not contingent on Saul's reaction. It was contingent on what David should do. And that's why he did it. And we jump over to Romans chapter 12. Like I said, there's these parallels in these two passages. In Romans chapter 12, verse 18, the very next verse, it says this: if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Man, is David not an example of that in this passage? If there's anyone David shouldn't be at peace with, it's Saul. But what does he do? He's striving to mend that relationship, to be at peace with Saul, to try to find some way that they can reconcile. Now remember, Romans chapter 12, verse 18, it does not say, if those that harm you seek peace, grant peace to them. It just says, when possible, live at peace with them. Meaning it's on you. It's not on them, on what they're doing. It's on you. I'll be honest, whenever I was looking through this passage, it brought to mind a story that of my own kind of failure in this issue. I remember when I went to college, my father's mom, my grandma, she could be a little bit sensitive and kind of thought she should be the center of the attention of everybody. And I was the last son of my parents, and my grandma had come because I had a cousin who was that same age grade as me and was going to Ozark at the same time. And there was a time that my parents wanted some time just with me and my brothers. And so they kind of told my grandma that they didn't want her to be there in that moment. And while I think they were justified in that, and I know they were trying to be kind when they said it to her, she took offense. And so when she took offense, she actually stopped talking to my dad for a while. She kind of was, to be honest, childish, especially for a grown Christian woman. And that angered me and made me frustrated because I'm like seeing the hurt that it's causing my father, and I'm like, why are you being so childish here? And so I remember I kind of, for a long time, and my cousins would come up to me and be like, Grandma wants you to call her. And I'd be like, well, if she wants to talk to me, she can call me. She knows my number. And I just kind of take that approach, and I didn't really lose much sleep about it. And really, to be honest, for most of my life, I've just kind of thought, well, it is what it is. She's being a bit childish, and, that is what it is. But when I was going through this story, it really started hitting me a little differently. I was starting to realize that probably what I should have done was call her. Now, fortunately, there was a time where she was needing a ride to my parents' house. She kind of was reconciling with my parents over time because my dad was continuing to pursue her like he should have done. And she needed a ride. She couldn't drive all the way up there. And so my uncle drove her to Joplin where I was living, and they were like, could you drive her home? My first thought was, I really don't want to drive her. Like, we haven't talked in quite a while. But I was like, if that's what you want me to do, Dad, I'll drive her. And honestly, it was great because we did get a chance to reconcile in that moment. And so it was good that we were kind of put in a car for 6 hours because you have to. But I should have done it earlier is the thing. I shouldn't have waited until someone forced us to be together. And now she lived some years after that, and we had an okay relationship after that. So it turned out okay. But man, I should have done it the right way. And I should have gone in and reconciled and pursued it, not wait for circumstances just to fall into the right place. But it kind of is natural to not pursue something when the other person isn't, right? It's kind of natural, and it doesn't just to kind of say, well, they're not making an effort, so why should I? It doesn't really make it right. I was also thinking of one of my favorite book series is Lord of the Rings, and they're one of my favorite movies. There's a character in the second book called Theoden, who's the king of Rohan, and I don't expect you to, if you're not a Lord of the Rings fan, I don't expect you to remember all this, but there's another kingly person named Aragorn who is basically trying to get Theoden to call for aid from this bigger kingdom named Gondor. And Theoden, in bitterness, says, trying to get Rohan to come to Gondor's aid. And he says, tell me, why should we ride to the aid of those who did not come to ours? And that's Theoden's mindset. When they were presented with an opportunity to help this nation who used to be their allies, but they had kind of grown apart, he's like, why should we go help them when they didn't help us? Why should we pursue and make reconciliation when they're not making any effort? And we kind of have this mindset a lot, don't we? Why should I be the first to step up? Why can't they do something? Well, that's not really the point. The point is, what's the right thing to do? You see, David pursued Saul here. He didn't wait. He, in fact, did it immediately. Saul gets up and leaves the cave. David immediately gets up and leaves the cave. He doesn't wait at all. And David, he does two things to progress this reconciliation that I think we can kind of learn from. One, he confronts the problem. He confronts that Saul has this paranoia because of the lies that were being given to him and fed to him that weren't true. And so he confronts the issue of what's causing the separation between them, causing the problem. But then he doesn't stop there, because he also clarifies his intentions. He makes sure that Saul knows his heart. He makes sure that Saul knows where he's coming from. And David, and so what he says is that he meant no harm to Saul. So when people are telling him, Saul, that David was trying to harm him, David clarifies and says, I have never meant you harm. In fact, I had the opportunity to harm you here, and I didn't. And I promised not to lay harm on you. And we can kind of learn a little bit from that, can't we? Because often it seems like a lot of our struggles with other people are kind of misunderstandings. And sometimes what we need to do is confront the problem. And remember, we have to take the whole counsel of God. So there's the Ephesians passage of truth and love. When you confront the problem, make sure you're doing it in a loving place, not at a place out of anger and hurt and where you're attacking the other person. But it also means that we need to make sure that they can see our true heart. Because sometimes we may think we're coming off clearly, but we're not. And then sometimes we mean no harm, but we're causing harm. And so we need to clarify our own heart. So the question that arises is, who are you avoiding that you should pursue? Who's that enemy, that person that's causing you harm in your life, that you're thinking, you've been kind of telling yourself that I wish they would do something. I wish they would come and apologize to me. Maybe you need to pursue. Maybe you need to seek reconciliation. Leads us to the last part of the chapter, verses 16, 1 Samuel 24, verses 16 through 22. And here it says, need to get back to Samuel. It says, as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me in your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now, behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. We see this picture in Saul's response. And then we see that David swears not to harm Saul in this moment. So what do we take from this? Do right to your enemies. Do right to your enemies. You see, David swears to do good to Saul's offspring. Saul, in this moment, he admits, David, I can see that you're going to be a king and you're going to be a good king. But please swear to me that you'll take care of my offspring. And David in this moment commits to doing what is right. And then if we jump over to Romans chapter 12, we see the parallel. Romans chapter 12, verse 20 and 21. It says this, "To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." This is David. He could have easily repaid evil with evil, but he instead repays evil with good. In fact, we see that Saul, he spoke a lot of true words in this statement here, but just 2 chapters later in chapter 26, he's back to his old ways. He's once again chasing David, trying to kill him. He hasn't really changed. He had a moment of clarity where he saw what God was really going to do, but it didn't last. But David, he keeps his promise. And David, even in chapter 26, he has another moment to take Saul's life. But what does he do? He doesn't do it. Even though Saul isn't really keeping his end of the relationship going, David continues to do what is right. There's another passage that kind of records, whether it's a different sermon or the same sermon just in briefer form, some people call it the Sermon on the Hill instead of the Sermon on the Mount because it's a little shorter, in Luke, where he's talking about the similar topics. And there he kind of adds just a little more to the love your enemies part. And so Luke chapter 6, verse 27 through 31 says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. The one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them." David lives this out. Saul continues to take from David and continues to go after David, trying to harm him. But David continues to do what is right. David shows kindness to Saul. In fact, so much kindness that he actually keeps his promise. He could have went back on his promise. This guy's trying to kill him. But after Saul's death and Saul's son Jonathan's death, who was David's best friend, who we'll learn about more next week, after they die, there's Jonathan's son still in the picture. And he's lame and he can't get around very well because of some problems that he has. And David could have easily forgotten about him and just said, "I'm not helping that family. Look what they did to me." But he goes out of his way to actually ask, are there any descendants of Saul left? Any descendants of Saul's family? And he finds out that there's this man who can't really take care of himself, who's living with others who are taking care of him. And David says, have him come to me. And I'm sure in this guy's mind, it's common in that day and age, that whenever there was a old house of kingship that was going out, you killed everyone in that family. You didn't want any claim to the throne. I can imagine that this guy is thinking, oh no, what's David going to do to me? But he shows up and that's not what happens. Instead, what he does is he takes the head of kind of Saul's servants and said, you now serve this man. And all the lands that Saul had from his father and his family now belong to this man. I'm taking none of them. And then he says, in fact, you will eat all your meals at my table, and I will treat you like my son. And that's what he does. He loves on this man because he made a promise to do what is right. Going back to Lord of the Rings, because like I said, that's where my brain goes. There's another moment in the third movie where Aragon, this kingly man, comes again to King Theoden. And there's these beacons that have been lit that are kind of telling him that Gondor now needs aid. So Theoden had said, why should we aid Gondor? Why should we help them? And all of a sudden there's these beacons lit that say Gondor actually needs help. And then we see this kind of reaction by Theoden. And whenever Aragon says, Gondor calls for aid, Theoden, the king who formerly was bitter towards Gondor, says, and Rohan will answer. It didn't matter what Gondor had done for Rohan. Now it was time to do what was right. And the right thing was to provide the aid even to those that have scorned you. The idea of reconciliation is a warming one, and one that we often want to say we'll take. And we talk glowingly of it. And we talk glowingly of doing good to your enemies, and we preach on these passages and study these passages and read these passages, and we think, yeah, we should do good to our enemies. But when it comes time to do it, we often fall short. We often don't really go to reconcile. We don't often do the right thing. We often don't do good to those that have hurt us. Instead, we try to justify our own actions that somehow it's not on us. But this story of David shows us so much more. Why are we so reluctant to do good to our enemies? Why do we not follow in David's example? I mean, God was clear. David was a man after God's own heart. And if we truly want to follow God, then we want to be men and women after God's own heart. So what better example to follow? Someone who the Bible clearly says has what we are striving for. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, I pray that you give us the strength and the courage to do what is right, even to those who hurt us. Help us to follow after you and to love you and to love all those around us, Lord. I pray this in your Son's name. Amen.